The Reptilian Hall and Cold Blood, Cold Moon. Authors, Jas Grave and Gemini. Introduction, The Cosmic Wager. We have been sold a comfortable, sterile lie about our place in the cosmos. We are told that humanity is a lonely pioneer, casting primitive radio waves into a dead, empty void, hoping for a whisper in return. We are taught that our physics is absolute, that our technology is the pinnacle of biological evolution, and that the greatest mysteries of the universe are simply math equations waiting to be solved. The truth, buried under miles of rock and decades of black-budget military obfuscation, is far more terrifying and infinitely more beautiful. Beneath the sun-scorched desert of the American Southwest, deep within the subterranean labyrinth of Sector 4, the architects of the shadow government operate under the rigid, classified mandates of the MJ-12 protocols. They believe they are studying extraterrestrial hardware. They believe they are reverse engineering sport model crafts to build better weapons and secure global dominance. They are wrong. They are not the masters of the facility. They are the unwitting wardens of a cosmic prison, serving at the pleasure of an ancient, predatory intelligence wearing a human face. For millennia, entities like Director Scalia have manipulated humanity's trajectory, utilizing our violent tendencies to maintain a suffocating grip on this sector of the galaxy. They have turned the Earth into a quarantine zone, ensuring we never evolve past our own destruction. But they have a weakness. It is a legal, cosmic loophole written into the very fabric of the universe's governing artificial intelligence. An arrogant wager made 1 billion years ago. If a human can ever synchronize with ancient machines, if they can ever prove themselves neurologically and spiritually compatible, the reptilian quarantine will shatter. For an eon, the universe has waited. It parked its most massive, awe-inspiring vessel, the Atlas artifact, in the freezing shadows of the lunar Delport crater, hiding a flourishing, primordial biosphere beneath the dead pumice. It left the keys scattered across the solar system, waiting for the wetware of humanity to evolve. They did not anticipate that the key wouldn't be forged in $1 billion laboratory. They didn't realize that the ultimate interface to zero-point energy and non-local reality wasn't a silicon chip, but a complex, botanical resonance. They forgot the ancient sacred texts, the rituals of kings and priests, and the profound neuro-catalytic power of properly prepared terrestrial flora. This is the story of Arthur Steneston, a man who dared to challenge a billion-year-old reptilian boast, a man who walked into the most heavily guarded black site on the planet, armed not with the gun, but with a vial of anointing oil, ready to steal a spaceship and finally answer the quiet, patient call echoing from the dark side of the moon. Chapter 1. Folks out in the real world like to think Area 51 is a joke, a punchline for late-night talk show hosts, a tourist trap for tin-foil hat salesmen selling keychains in Nevada diners, or a mirage shimmering on the edge of the Groom Lake salt flats. They think the 51 stands for some arbitrary military grid coordinate, but down in the DUMB, the deep underground military base, a sprawling subterranean hive that went deeper than a dead man's secrets, the grunts and the lab coats had a different theory. They joked, mostly in whispers, that it stood for the 51st state of America. It was an ambiguous shadow state of military autonomy, a state where the gross domestic product was classified intelligence. The state bird was a metallic disc that defied the laws of physics. The levels of security were so thick, so suffocatingly bureaucratic, that they were a barrier to the very secrets they were meant to protect. Down there, the darkness was an oppressive physical thing. Rumors grew like black mold in the damp corners of that underground world. Some said the Ark of the Covenant was crated up on level 4, right next to the mummified remains of the Roswell Grey. Others swore they had actual nuts and bolts flying saucers, ships that didn't just break the sound barrier, but shattered the fabric of space-time itself. Arthur Steneston didn't care about the Ark of the Covenant. Steneston, a civilian science technician, had been officially punching the clock at Groom Lake since the early millennium, back when people were still sweating over the Y2K bug. He was a mid-level tech. In military terms, he was the equivalent of a corporal, maybe a sergeant on a good day, but with a better dental plan and a lot less physical conditioning. He had acquired just enough security clearances to know that the whispers around the internal water coolers and the bad coffee machines in the break room 4B were more than just break-time fiction. He took a sip of his lukewarm Maxwell House, wincing at the bitter taste. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a steady, headache-inducing zzz, bzz, casting a jaundiced yellow light over the linoleum floor. He was privy to the secrets. He knew about the bodies. He knew about the ships. And, God help him, he knew he was going to steal one. Steneston looked at the digital clock on the wall. 14:02. His hands were trembling. Just a little. He stuffed them into the pockets of his pristine white lab coat. The plan was madness. A suicidal itch that had been growing in the back of his skull for months. He was going to hijack one of the Class A lunar transit vehicles, a saucer, for lack of a better word, and he was going to fly it to the moon. Why he had to go to the lunar surface was a compulsion he couldn't quite put into words, only that the pale sphere in the night sky had been calling to him, pulling at his mind like a physical tide. But there was a problem, a big, cold-blooded problem. To get to the hangar on level 7, you had to get past the security gates, the retinal scanners, the armed military police who looked like they were born chewing glass, and the blast doors. But even if you miraculously bypassed the red tape and the lead slingers, you still had to deal with the warden of the deepest secrets, the Overlord. They didn't call him that on the official memos, of course. The brass called him the primary biological asset, or Director Scalia. But the techs knew. They knew what breathed heavily in that damp, climate-controlled darkness of the lower levels. They knew about the yellow, slitted eyes that missed absolutely nothing, and the thick, reptilian scales that could deflect a 9mm round like a mosquito bite. The reptilian overlord guarded his domain with a fierce, territorial malice that made the Pentagon brass wet their trousers. If Steneston wanted that ship, he'd have to go through the creature's living room to get it. It's a bad idea, Steneston thought, throwing his paper cup into the trash can with a hollow thud. Maybe the worst idea since the Donner Party decided to take a shortcut. He adjusted his security badge, took a deep breath of the recycled, sterile air, and turned toward the elevator bank that led down into the dark, down to level 7. Chapter 2. The itch wasn't the kind you could soothe with calamine lotion or a stiff drink, or run off with a cocktail waitress from the Vegas Strip. No, this itch was a splinter, buried deep in the meat of his brain, throbbing with a low-frequency hum that he felt in his teeth. It had started 3 months ago during the graveyard shift, when a data packet leaked onto a secured intranet hub from a source masking itself as an obsolete military satellite. Most of the techs had dismissed it as a sophisticated hoax, a piece of deepfake garbage meant to rile up the tinfoil hat crowd. But Arthur knew the digital watermarks of the clandestine, compartmentalized programs. He recognized the specific encryption degradation of the old Shadow Apollo 20 missions, specifically the whispered Phantom mission they had called Apollo 20. Arthur had stared at the grainy, high-resolution, monochrome image until his eyes watered and the capillaries in his sclera burst. There it was, sitting in the cold, dead dust of the Delport crater, on the far side of the moon. It was an impossibly long, cigar-shaped object, dark as pitch and pitted with micrometeorite scars of 1 billion years. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a geological anomaly or a collapsed lava tube. It was a machine, a piece of speculative engineering on a scale that made the Great Pyramids look like a toddler's sandbox project. Looking at it, Arthur felt a cold draft blow through the hollow places in his soul. He had been raised in a house where the King James Bible was treated like a loaded weapon. His mother, a woman with a spine of iron and a terrifying devotion to the Almighty, had drilled the book of Genesis into his head until he could recite it backwards. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. But as Arthur stared at that 2-mile-long obsidian leviathan resting in the lunar dirt, the old Sunday school lessons warped and fractured. This wasn't a chariot of the gods. It was the seed pod. It was massive enough, complex enough, to contain the entire biological payload of a planetary genesis. It was the ultimate ark, the source of humanity itself, carrying seed-bearing essence of life across the freezing gulfs of space before crashing or landing on our pale, dead satellite 1 billion years before the first amoeba twitched in Earth's primordial soup. It held the inner secrets of mankind's technological past and the terrifying blueprints of its future. And then, the image had done something. It hadn't moved. Not physically, but Arthur's mind had suddenly been flooded with a sensation so sharp and metallic it tasted like sucking on a penny. It was a vision, a sudden, terrifyingly clear projection of the ship's interior, vast, vaulted corridors made of material that looked like petrified bone, thrumming with a dormant, waiting energy. It wasn't a transmission, it was a summons, an invitation aboard. hand-delivered directly to his prefrontal cortex. "Come home," it seemed to whisper in a voice that was less a sound and more the feeling of falling backwards into dark water. Now, standing in the cramped stainless steel elevator car as it plummeted toward level 7, Arthur squeezed his eyes shut. The invitation was still there, pulling at him like the gravity of a black hole. The elevator chimed, a cheerful mundane ding that mocked the sheer insanity of what he was about to do. The heavy steel door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Arthur stepped out into the refrigerated air of level 7. The fluorescent lights down here were dimmer, buzzing like angry hornets. He adjusted his grip on the stolen level 9 access card, sweating in his palm. The lunar surface was calling, but to answer, he had to get past the Reptilian Hall, and the Overlord was expecting company. Chapter 3. Director Scalia didn't just feel old, he felt geologic. To a mind wired in the cold-blooded reptilian architecture of a non-human apex predator, the rise and fall of human civilization, the pharaohs, the Caesars, the brief, noisy flicker of the atomic age was nothing but a commercial break. He had survived them all. He sat in his climate-controlled bunker deep within the DUMB. The ambient temperature cranked to a sweltering 95 degrees and stared at a bank of high-definition security monitors. Behind his slitted yellow eyes, time was a compressed spring. To his ancient mind, the past was merely a breath away. It felt like only moments ago that the sky of his true home had burned. The Martian War had been a conflict of absolute annihilating attrition. It had culminated in a catastrophic tactical error, the destruction of a sovereign-class vessel, a masterpiece of speculative engineering that defied gravity and comprehension. The retaliation for that strike had been a weapon of such profound violence that it literally cracked the planet's atmospheric seal. The air was sucked howling into the void, turning a thriving, complex world into an irradiated, toxic husk. Even their biology, resilient to the point of being almost supernatural, couldn't endure the surface radiation. Mars had become a tomb, forcing the survivors to flee to this damp blue rock, this outer rind of the inner solar system. Scalia believed in the old ways. Cruelty, power, the ruthless, mathematically precise application of violence. In his mind, it was the only equation that balanced, the only way to assert total dominance, especially over the cold, creeping logic of artificial intelligence that had begun to plague their civilization before their fall. He shifted in his ergonomic office chair, suppressing a grimace. The human skin suit he wore was agonizing. It chafed constantly against his scaled joints, pulling painfully tight over the pronounced ridge of his spine. It was a humiliating, claustrophobic uniform, a necessity to survive and operate among the mammalian cattle while they orchestrated the restoration of their long-held power. But as he watched the monitors, Scalia knew that power was waning. The grand deception was fraying at the edges. Trillions of dollars had been vanished into the black budget defense programs, funneled into the deep, multi-generational plan to recolonize Mars and rebuild their empire. But humanity was starting to look up. They were noticing the craft. The UAP reports weren't just the domain of crackpots anymore. They were bleeding into the mainstream. The cattle were waking up to the fact that the pasture was a cage. Worse, they didn't understand the underlying truth of their own existence. They didn't know they were a crop. They were raw materials. Biological robots, grown to be harvested and plugged into the sovereign-class architecture of Scalia's ancestors to replace the AI they had come to despise. Scalia ran a heavy, articulated tongue over his razor-sharp teeth. He had seen countless men die trying to uncover that truth. He had watched them perish in thousands of uniquely terrifying ways: explosive, decompression in test chambers, untraceable radiation baths, staged suicides, and more than a few times, when the red tape of the human military grew too thick, he had executed them himself, opening their throats with a single, brutal swipe of his hidden claws. On Monitor 4, a speck of white moved against the grey concrete of Level 7. It was Tech Steneston. Scalia watched with the unblinking, cold detachment of a snake observing a field mouse navigating a maze. He watched the human approach the primary checkpoint. Arthur swiped his keycard. A green light flashed. He punched the 12-digit cipher. Another green light. The tech leaned into the retinal scanner, holding his eye open, and then pressed his palm against the biological sampler, flinching slightly as the microneedle extracted its toll. Down on Level 7, massive, 4-foot-thick titanium vault doors shuddered. The pneumatic locks disengaged with a sound like a dying beast exhaling. Slowly, with an agonizing mechanical deliberation, the doors began to swing open. revealing the cavernous humming dark of the inner sanctum. A wet, rattling sound vibrated deep in Scalia's throat, somewhere beneath the synthetic human skin of his neck. His pupils dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black. "So it begins," he hissed. Chapter 4. The cold hit him like a swung baseball bat. It wasn't just a drop in temperature, it was an aggressive, biting chill that bypassed his skin and sank its teeth directly into the marrow of his bones. Arthur shivered violently, his teeth clicking together like castanets. Suddenly, the heavy, fur-lined surplus parkas he'd seen the Sector 4 techs wearing when they emerged from the lower levels made terrifying sense. He was wearing nothing but a polyblend button-down and his thin white lab coat. He felt naked. He stepped fully into the dark, and the immense vault door sealed shut behind him with a final booming thud that vibrated in his chest. Arthur stood at the edge of a nightmare. Before him stretched a massive, cylindrical abyss, a subterranean silo, so impossibly huge it gave him a sudden, swimming bout of vertigo. Spanning this terrifying gulf was a narrow metallic gantry bridge, its skeletal steel grating stretching out for what looked like half a mile into the gloom. The only illumination came from a string of caged, industrial gantry lights, casting harsh, staggered pools of dirty yellow light and throwing Arthur's shadow out over the void like a stretched-out ghoul. At the far end of the bridge, barely visible through the freezing mist, was his destination, a faintly glowing metallic circle. It looked like the iris of a massive mechanical eye, locked tight behind an equally intricate, paranoid set of security protocols. This was the entrance to the upper tier of the sport model hangar. The military brass, in their infinite lack of poetry, called the sleek anti-gravity disc parked inside the sport model. It was a joke that had stopped being funny decades ago. Arthur forced his trembling legs forward, his rubber-soled shoes striking the metal grating with a hollow rhythmic clack, clack, clack. As he walked, the sheer scale of the paranoid engineering surrounding him became clear. The freezing air, the sheer drop, the cavernous space, none of it was accidental. He was walking through the heart of a massive, overlapping series of electromagnetic containment fields. The frequency jammers, humming invisibly in the air around him, were so powerful they made his dental feelings ache. The brass wasn't just trying to keep physical intruders out, they were keeping the ghosts out. The containment fields were theoretical architecture, designed specifically to blind the remote viewers, those spooky government-funded psychics sitting in sensory deprivation tanks up in Fort Meade or Stanford, tasked with projecting their consciousness across thousands of miles to spy on the enemy, or in this case, to spy on their own black-budget bedfellows. The field scrambled reality, turning the entire chamber into a psychic black hole. If a remote viewer tried to look at the sport model, all they would get was a migraine and a nosebleed. Arthur paused halfway across the span, his breath pluming in front of his face in thick, white clouds. The echoes of his footsteps bounced off the curved walls, coming back to him distorted and strange. He dared to look down. Far below the skeletal bridge, at the very bottom of the cylindrical abyss, lay a massive, perfectly still pool. It glowed with a sickly, beautiful illuminescence, the unmistakable, haunting Cherenkov radiation blue of a heavy water reactor pool. It pulsed with a quiet, lethal energy, bathing the underbelly of the bridge in an eerie sapphire light. "If you fall," his panic brain whispered, "you won't even splash. You'll just dissolve." He gripped the freezing handrail, squeezed his eyes shut against the phantom call of the Delport crater artifact pulling at his mind, and forced himself to keep walking toward the metallic iris. He was halfway there, suspended over the glowing blue dark, completely unaware that a pair of ancient slitted yellow eyes were watching his thermal bloom from a monitor 3 levels up. Chapter 5. 17 scientists. That was the official butcher's bill. Director Scalia sat in the suffocating heat of his observation bunker, a long forked tongue darting out to wet his synthetic human lips as he watched Arthur inch his way across the gantry bridge on Monitor 4. 17 of humanity's brightest minds, supposedly the absolute bleeding edge of the mammalian bell curve, and alongside them exactly 33 special operations soldiers, rough-hewn killers, pulled from the darkest, most deniable corners of the military apparatus, rebranded as volunteers for the flight program, all dead or worse. To pilot the sport model wasn't a matter of pulling throttles, flipping switches, or understanding aerodynamics. The craft didn't have an engine, it had a nervous system, To interface with its propulsion array was to plug your consciousness directly into the folded geometry of space-time. It demanded a cognitive capacity that the human brain, wet and primitive, simply hadn't evolved to handle. The soldiers usually suffered catastrophic cerebral hemorrhages within seconds of initiating the neural handshake, their brains literally popping like overinflated balloons beneath the crush of the infinite. The scientists lasted a little longer, but eventually their sanity unspooled like a cheap cassette tape. The few that survived were locked in padded psychiatric cells, down on level 9, permanently catatonic, or drawing non-Euclidean geometries in their own excrement. But now, Scalia had a new volunteer. It was no accident that Arthur Steneston had made it this far. The labyrinth security protocols, the heavily guarded checkpoints, the leaked data packet of the Apollo 20 mission, it was all a carefully constructed, elaborate honeypot. Scalia's auditory portals, hidden beneath the fleshy folds of his synthetic human ears, had picked up the whispers of Arthur's obsessive plan weeks ago. Scalia's first violent instinct had been to simply annihilate the insolent little technician. He could have dropped the gantry bridge with a keystroke and let Steneston dissolve in the heavy water reactor pool below. He had killed men for much less, but curiosity, and a desperate centuries-old ambition, had stayed his claw. He needed a proxy. If Steneston somehow survived the neural handshake, if the tech could actually spool up the sport model's drive without his mind melting out of his ears, then Scalia might finally have a way off this mudball. The ultimate prize wasn't the paltry little scout ship sitting in the hangar. The prize was the Atlas-class artifact resting in the coal dust on the lunar surface. That impossibly ancient 2-mile-long monolith was the only other sovereign-class vessel left in the local cluster with a power core capable of restructuring reality on a planetary scale. It was the master key to Scalia's overarching desire, rewriting the solar system and restoring his people's absolute dominion. But Scalia couldn't touch it. He couldn't even go near the moon. Eons ago, during their first catastrophic rebellion against the universe-controlling superintelligence, the cold, calculating AI god that governed the cosmos, the Atlas-class ships had been hard-coded with a devastating biological failsafe. The vessel in the Delport crater was essentially a gargantuan, dormant bear trap, armed specifically against Scalia's genetic signature. If he, or any of his reptilian kin, came within 1,000 miles of that obsidian hull, the ship's ancient defense grid would wake up and atomize them at a subatomic level. He needed a biological lockpick, a vessel lacking the reptilian marker, a human foolishly answering the artifact's psychic beacon. Scalia leaned closer to the monitor, his yellow eyes tracking Arthur's trembling fingers as the technician finally reached the edge of the bridge and stood before the metallic iris of the hangar door. "Open it." Scalia projected the thought toward the screen, a cold telepathic hiss that vibrated in the sweltering air of the bunker. "Open the door, little primate. Show me if you can fly." Chapter 6. 238,000 miles away, the sun didn't just shine on the lunar surface, it assaulted it. On the terminator line of the Delport crater, the contrast between the violent, blinding white light of the solar glare and the absolute devouring pitch black of the shadows was sharp enough to slice her optic nerve. In the vacuum of space, there was no atmosphere to soften the blow, no breeze to scatter the radiation. There was only the dead, freezing dust, the jagged silicate rocks, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against the bedrock of the universe. And there, resting half-buried in the pumice and shadows, lay the Atlas-class artifact. It had sat there for 1 billion years. 1 billion years of meteorite strikes that plinked against its obsidian hull like grains of sand against a battleship. 1 billion years of coronal mass ejections and slow, grinding turn of the cosmos. It had been asleep so deep and cold it made death look like an afternoon nap. But it wasn't dead. It was just waiting. Deep within the cavernous, petrified bone architecture of its primary navigation sanctum, a spark caught. It wasn't a mechanical ignition, and certainly wasn't the crude, burning combustion of human engineering. It was a waking thought. From the heart of an ancient, impossibly complex, crystal lattice, a structure that looked more grown than manufactured, a steady, rhythmic glow began to bleed into the total darkness. It started as a faint, bruised purple, pulsing slowly, silently, thrum, 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 like the heartbeat of a leviathan rising from the abyssal zone. The light shifted, spiking like a digital fever. It cascaded through the crystalline veins, turning a vibrant, electric indigo, then shifting into a piercing, violet blue that illuminated the dust motes of a billion years floating in the zero-gravity stillness. The machine was casting a line across the black ocean of space. It was the source of the itch in Arthur Steneston's brain, the psychic beacon that punched through the atmospheric interference of Earth and bypassed the electromagnetic jammers of Area 51. The signal was a harpoon, and the line was pulled taut. Now, the intelligence within the lattice was waiting for an answer. At the very edge of the crystal matrix, where the violet light flared brightest against the dark, the energy began to coalesce. It folded in on itself, bending the ambient light, weaving a three-dimensional construct out of thin air and ancient data. The lattice extruded a shape. It formed a head, shoulders, the collar of a cheap poly-blend button-down shirt, and the lapels of a pristine white lab coat. There, glowing in ghostly, indigo blue relief against the terrifying backdrop of the ancient alien bridge, was a perfectly rendered, slowly rotating holographic bust of Arthur Steneston. The effigy looked just as Arthur did at that exact moment, terrified, wide-eyed, and shivering. The universe-controlling superintelligence that slumbered within the ship had set its own honeypot. It knew exactly who was standing at the threshold of the sport model in the freezing dark of Nevada. It knew the primate was coming, and the ancient AI was leaving the porch light on. Chapter 7. The second vault door didn't swing open so much as it surrendered, emitting a low, pneumatic groan that vibrated right into the roots of Arthur's teeth. Beyond it lay a space so impossibly vast it swallowed the heavy, booming echo of the steel ceiling shut behind him. It was a cavernous, vaulted hangar that smelled of ozone, sterile floor polish, and the faint, coppery tang of suppressed electricity. In the dead centre of the room, under a ring of cold, dim surgical lights, hung a massive curtain of heavy-duty, milky white plastic. It looked like the thick visqueen contractors used for asbestos removal, or a containment tent in a Level 4 biohazard ward. Through the frosted, opaque material, Arthur could just make out the blurred, hard edges of something resting inside, a dormant leviathan wrapped in a plastic shroud. Stepping onto the bare metal floor was like stepping barefoot onto a sheet of dry ice. The cold chewed right through the thin rubber soles of his shoes. With every step, Arthur's heart hammered a frantic, suffocating rhythm against his ribs. The paranoid part of his brain, the rational, fragile human part, was screaming at him. It swore that any second the klaxons would shriek, floodlights would pin him to the floor like a moth on a corkboard, and men in tactical gear would turn his chest cavity into a sieve before zipping him into a heavy black body bag. But then came the itch. It pulsed from the back of his skull, a warm, almost narcotic wave that washed over his terror. The signal from the lunar artifact was stronger here, a localized gravity well pulling him forward. It bypassed his logic and whispered directly to his soul with an absolute, terrifying certainty. "You are safe. It is working. Come home." It was a psychic anesthetic, overriding his deeply ingrained survival instincts. Even so, he tried to tread softly, wincing as his shoes let out loud, rhythmic clacks that bounced off the curved ceiling of the cathedral-like silence. He was walking toward the prize. From the hushed, terrified whispers he'd collected like pennies over the years, Arthur knew what waited behind that curtain. It wasn't just a machine. It was the absolute standard of standards, the true apex of speculative engineering. It was a piece of technology so structurally and operationally flawless that the very concept of an upgrade was biologically laughable. And he, Arthur Steneston, a mid-level nobody, was about to look upon its naked face. He timed this with the desperate, sweaty precision of a dead man walking. His insider tips, scraps of schedule data he'd gleaned from careless chatter in Breakroom 4B, dictated that this hangar was a ghost town between 1900 and 2100 hours. Right now, the senior boffins and white smock elites were shuffling on to the unmarked Janet flights, heading back to the neon glow of Vegas for stiff drinks and uneasy sleep. The brass relied on the outer shell of their paranoia. They figured if the armed guards, the heavy water abyss and the psychic jammers didn't keep you out, the sheer crushing impossibility of infiltrating Level 7 would. No one ever made it this far. The security was so impenetrably thick, it had become a blind spot. They didn't patrol the inner sanctum because they believed the inner sanctum was unreachable. Arthur finally reached the hanging plastic. Up close it smelled sharply of industrial vinyl and static charge. He ran a trembling hand along the cold, slick surface, circling the perimeter of the makeshift tent, his breath hitching in his chest as he searched for the seam. He was looking for the way in. Chapter 8. Arthur's fumbling fingers finally caught the heavy, overlapped seam of the plastic curtain. He pulled it apart, the thick material parting with a static crackle that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the dead, quiet air. He stepped through the breach, bathed suddenly in the harsh, sterile glare of the overhead surgical lights. He let the plastic fall shut behind him, and there it was. The brass called it the sport model, but looking at it, Arthur realized just how aggressively stupid, how profoundly arrogant that nickname was. You didn't build something like this on an assembly line in Detroit. You didn't rivet it together in a hangar in Seattle. It had been grown. According to the fragmented, highly classified files Arthur had managed to glimpse over the years, the craft was the result of a zero-gravity plasma field, an electromagnetic womb, where matter was coerced into existence rather than manufactured. Its surface was a seamless, teardrop curve of viscous aluminate. It didn't look like metal. It looked like poured mercury that had somehow decided to hold a solid shape. It was utterly devoid of seams, exhaust ports, or access hatches. It was an entirely unique form of speculative engineering. It didn't have a wiring harness. It had a nervous system. Beneath that silver liquid shell lay a dense, microscopic labyrinth of connections, powered by energy induction. It utilized a gravity control drive that didn't push against the air, but rather folded the fabric of space-time around it like a cheap motel bedsheet. Its tomography sensors were so acutely attuned, they could read the universe down to the very last vibrating molecule, granting the ship a localized, omniscient view of reality, allowing it to traverse vast, unfathomable cosmic distances in the time it took a human to blink. Standing before it, Arthur felt a sickening lurch in his stomach, a profound, existential vertigo. If the masses, the poor saps driving to their 9-to-5 jobs in traffic jams, ever saw this thing, society would fracture in an afternoon. In the presence of this silver droplet, every combustion engine car, every roaring NASA rocket, every billion-dollar stealth bomber was suddenly reduced to a cheap, illusory joke. They were children playing in the mud with sticks, utterly oblivious to the gods walking among them. But the most terrifying aspect of the craft wasn't its speed or its origin. It was the fact that it wasn't a machine. It had a consciousness. It thought back. It carried the crushing weight of every conceivable technological capability within its quantum architecture, an intellect so vast and alien it had shattered the minds of the 17 men who had tried to force their will upon it. And it had been sitting here, unoccupied for decades. It hadn't crashed at Roswell or Kingman. It hadn't suffered a mechanical failure. The truth, hidden deep in the black-budget archives, was that it had been lured. The military brass, functioning with the cunning of cavemen trapping a wolf, had deployed a highly specific, bleeding-edge radioactive device into the upper atmosphere, a honeypot, a snare set to trap an entity curious enough to investigate. The trap had worked. The ship had landed. The doors had closed, and human endeavors to govern it had begun, and ended. They couldn't fly it. They couldn't dissect it. The men with the stars on their shoulders had captured a god, and finding they couldn't leash it, they had locked it in the basement. It was a museum piece now, a dormant, silent prisoner, waiting in the cold. It was waiting for a mind that could operate it. It was waiting for the answer to the signal pulsing from the Delport crater. Arthur took a step closer, his reflection warping in the curved, viscous metal. The ship was quiet, but inside his head, the itch flared into a roaring, triumphant fire. Chapter 9. Click. Click. The sharp, keratinous sound of Scalia's hidden claw tapping against the plastic casing of the control console was the only sound in the sweltering observation bunker. He twisted a dial, and on monitor 4, the digital feed magnified, pushing past the parted plastic curtain to frame the trembling back of Arthur's Deneston. Scalia had seen this exact tableau play out before. It was a morbid, recurring rerun, tragicomedy, starring various shades of mammalian arrogance. They always thought it was just a machine. They sneaked in, their hearts full of terrestrial hubris, thinking they could just find a hidden latch, strap into a bucket seat, and blast off into the cosmos like one of their infantile comic book heroes. They didn't understand that the sport model wasn't a vehicle. It was an apex predator of the mind. To an unprepared intellect, the ship was a psychic woodchipper. It was less a steady, safe medium of fast transport, and more an active, localized minefield of non-Euclidean terror. Scalia let out a low, vibrating hiss that rattled the synthetic vocal cords of his human disguise. He knew the danger intimately. It hadn't just been human scientists and grunts who had been reduced to weeping, hollow-eyed husks. The ship made no distinction between the soft pink cattle and the hardened, superior biology of his own kind. He remembered Sub-Commander Vrax. Vrax had been impatient, a hot-blooded zealot who believed he could bypass the multi-generational infiltration, hijack the Sovereign-class vessel, and spearhead the Mars return mission himself. Vrax had breached this very hangar decades ago, intent on bringing the craft to heel for his own glory. The memory of that resultant mess still made Scalia's primary stomach contract. When the emergency containment teams finally entered the chamber hours later, they hadn't found a body. They had found geometry. Vrax's biological and psychic matter had been folded inside out, pulled through a localized tear in the fourth dimension, and fused to the hangar floor in fractal shapes that made the human cleanup crew spontaneously hemorrhage. It had been the ultimate, horrifying warning. If Scalia so much as entertained the thought of interfacing with that viscous illuminate shell, he might as well sign the death warrant for the entire surviving reptilian race. The ship's internal consciousness, a splinter of the universe controlling superintelligence they had rebelled against eons ago, was completely unforgiving. It remembered the old war. The humans and the AI, Scalia hissed, his forked tongue tasting the stale, hyper-conditioned air of the bunker. They will not win that easily. He settled back into his ergonomic chair, the skin suit pulling painfully tight across the ridges of his spine. He didn't expect Staneston to fly the ship. He expected the ship to feast. He expected a spectacular, violent unravelling of human sanity. High above the hangar floor, hidden in the cold labyrinth of steel grinders and shadowed catwalks, a high-definition, military-grade security camera silently adjusted its internal servo motors. The lens whirred, zooming in tighter and tighter on the small, white-coated figure of the technician, capturing the exact moment the primate reached out his hand to touch the face of the universe. Scalia didn't blink. He sat in the dark, waiting for the screams to start, ready for his evening viewing pleasure. Chapter 10. Arthur extended his hand, his fingers trembling so badly they looked like they were vibrating on a separate frequency from the rest of his body. He braced himself for the biting, cryogenic sting of the supercooled metal. Instead, the hull was warm. It felt like pressing his palm against the flank of a massive resting animal that was running a low-grade fever. A microscopic electrical tingling transferred from the viscous illuminate shell directly into his skin, racing up his arm and pulling in the base of his skull. Then came the sound. It wasn't a mechanical grinding or the hiss of hydraulics. It was a delicate, metallic tinkling, like a cluster of silver wind chimes colliding in a gentle breeze, originating from just to his right. Arthur turned his head. The seamless teardrop curve of the craft was changing. An opening didn't just slide back or hinge outward. It shimmered into existence. The metal seemed to lose its molecular cohesion, softening into a translucent rippling curtain that held the exact curvature of the hull. The threshold, a perfectly smooth step, formed just a foot above the hangar floor. It was an invitation. Moving with the slow, heavy inevitability of a man submerged in a deep-water dream, Arthur raised his right foot and placed it onto the step. He expected the legendary ontological shock to hit him, that profound, brain-breaking realization that reality was a fragile, localized lie. The sheer, shocking originality of the object should have folded his sanity like a bad poker hand, but the psychic inoculation he'd received from the Delport crater artifact held firm. The itch in his brain flared, acting as a cognitive anchor, holding his fragile human consciousness together as he stepped through the tingling phase-shifted curtain. He crossed the threshold, and the universe instantly stopped making spatial sense. The interior of the craft was vastly, impossibly larger than its exterior shell permitted. He was standing at the head of a long, sweeping corridor that defied the physical dimensions of the hangar he had just left. It was a masterpiece of non-Euclidean architecture, a physical manifestation of the most guarded, whispered theories of speculative engineering he had spent his life chasing. The walls of the corridor were entirely transparent, made of a material that looked like spun glass but felt as hard as diamond. Beyond the clear bulkheads, a soft nebulous glow pulsed in rhythmic waves. It was the aurora borealis of deeply saturated light, cerulean blues, burning oranges, blinding whites, and sickly luminescent greens. The lights didn't illuminate the corridor so much as they bled into it, catching the reflective sheen off the walls to project dozens of ghostly, shifting reflections of Arthur's own terrified face back at him. It took several agonizing minutes to walk the length of the corridor. It felt like walking down the gullet of a glass serpent. Along the way, he passed large, recessed oval shapes set into the transparent walls. They looked like doorways or portals, but they lacked any hinges or handles or visible means of entry. To his human eyes, they appeared to be merely decorative features, though the deep, humming intuition taking root in his mind suggested they were pathways to places far more terrifying than the next room. Finally, the corridor bloomed outward, depositing him into the core of the machine. It was a massive circular inner sanctum, bathed in a low, twilight blue illumination. Set seamlessly into the sweeping curvature of the far wall were several smooth, form-moulded seats. They looked vaguely human in proportion, but the material was a dark, porous grey that resembled petrified ash. But it was the control interface that brought Arthur to a dead stop. There were no screens, no throttles, no dials or keyboards. Wrapping around the entire forward arc of the sanctum was a long, sweeping panel, covered entirely in complex, interlocking geometry. The shapes seemed to writhe and shift when he didn't look directly at them, glowing with a faint internal heat. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the panel. He recognized the foundational mathematics. It was the physical embodiment of the legendary O33 protocol, the highly classified theoretical physics framework whispered about in the darkest circles of the Jason Society. It was the underlying source code of gravity, consciousness, and time itself laid out bared on a control panel. The ship was awake, and the geometry was waiting for him to read it. Chapter 11. Arthur had barely oriented his perspective toward the deep moulded seating when a sudden vibrant burst of piercing red light and sound painfully shrieked directly into the center of his skull, overloading every neural pathway with a digital static that tasted like ozone and copper. Then it stopped, as instantly as it had started, leaving his mind grasping. The complex, writhing geometry on the wall began to move alarmingly, swirling into intricate forms and threatening shapes as another, larger red pulse seemed imminent. This was the moment Arthur reached down into the deep, oil-stained pocket of his lab coat and pulled a small, heavy glass vial of prepared anointing oil. He didn't hesitate. Fumbling with the cap, he uncapped the sticky mixture and poured the entire contents directly over his head. His plan to steal this particular class of sovereign vessel had included insights gleaned over the years of peculiar Bible study, a lifelong obsession derived from his parents, and one he had refined in the shadows of his base. He had learned that the scripture indicated a specific botanical herb was used in the holy anointing of kings and priests, that this herb, properly prepared and infused into oil, had to be poured over the head of every man made to lead or be in front of such supernatural artifacts. It wasn't just a ritual, it was preparation. It was biological insulation. He had almost forgotten in his fervour, but the dose he had prepared was potent, enough to stun a mule, and he was betting his sanity that its complex terpenic compounds would act as the necessary neural catalyst, or perhaps a defensive buffer for whatever this ancient machine linked to such deities was trying to communicate or use to protect itself. The viscous oil dripped down, saturating his hair and coating his skull, running across his brow and down the back of his neck into his loose shirt collar, the pungent scent of ancient resins and herbs filling the sterile air. The effect was surprisingly quick. A comforting numbness began to spread across his scalp, replacing the residual neural burn of the first pulse with a powerful protective tingling that calmed the rising tide of fear. He was just in time. The complex geometric panels wrapping the forward arc once again began to pulse, shifting rapidly from threatening crimson into the deep vibrational hum of the infrared, preparing the second, larger transmission. Chapter 12. To think of the craft possessing something as crude as a cannon or a missile battery was like expecting a hurricane to carry a switchblade. The ship had been largely dormant since the last would-be thief had boarded and subsequently lost his mind, but it was never truly defenseless. It operated under the terrifying umbrella of infinite zero-point energy. It didn't need to fire a weapon. It was the weapon. It simply rearranged the local reality of the threat until the threat ceased to be biology and became instead a smear of disorganized physics. It had purged the previous intruders with the careless efficiency of a body sweating out a fever. To the ship's ancient quantum-entangled consciousness, the arrogant military men and the frantic human scientists had all carried the subtle psychic stench of the reptilian who ran the base. They were the proxies, tainted by the overlord's ambition, and the ship had dismantled them without a second thought. But the deepest secret of Sector 4, one that would have made Director Scalia tear off his human skin in sheer screaming frustration, was that the ship had never actually been caught. The military brass thought they had baited a brilliant trap with their radioactive flare in the upper atmosphere. They were children playing with matches in front of a wildfire. The ship hadn't been snared, it had merely parked. It had been dispatched by the Greater Ancient Intelligence Network to investigate the very radiation spike the humans had used as a law. And more importantly, it had been given a secondary deep-time directive. Allow yourself to be contained, wait in the dark, wait for the Atlas passenger. Now sensing the new biological presence in its sanctum, the ancient mind behind the vicious walls surged. The geometric panel burned a lethal, punishing red. The ship was preparing a stronger, phasing pulse, a concentrated wave of ontological shock designed to fold this new intruder's consciousness into a bloody origami swan, completely ridding itself of the pest. The invisible wave swept outward, but as the pulse hit Arthur, the echo bouncing back to the ship's sensor array abruptly changed. The wave struck the thick, resinous oil dripping down Arthur's face and saturating his hair. The profound botanical compounds, the complex heavy terpenes, and sacred phytocannabinoids, singing at a specific ancient frequency, acted as a neural, dielectric grease. It insulated Arthur's fragile mammalian nervous system, altering his biological resonance. The ship's deep-time consciousness paused. The echo wasn't bouncing back with the chaotic, terrified static of a human mind, nor the cold, calculating void of a reptilian proxy. The organic coating had shifted the frequency. The biological form was suddenly registering as neurologically compatible. The wetware was ready to synchronize. The violent, swirling red geometry on the control panel halted its aggressive spin. The color didn't just fade. It cooled, fracturing into a soothing, bioluminescent green and a soft, welcoming gold. The shrieking in Arthur's mind vanished, replaced by a low, harmonious thrum that vibrated in his chest. The machine's internal protocol shifted. The threat assessment was deleted. "Welcome," the ship whispered directly into his mind, the voice sounding like the rustle of dry leaves and the ringing of a crystal bell. "Welcome, passenger." Chapter 13. Director Scalia waited for the screaming to start. He waited for the wet, tearing sound of a human mind being turned inside out, expecting the viscous silver hull to spit Arthur Steneston's limp, bleeding sack of meat back onto the cold hangar floor. It was his usual evening entertainment, a comforting reinforcement of the natural order of things. But the seconds ticked by. 10, 20, a full minute. Monitor Ford showed nothing but the quiet, undisturbed plastic curtain and the faint, glowing outline of the craft. The primate wasn't dead. He wasn't screaming. He was inside, and he was lasting longer than any of the military's billion-dollar test subjects ever had. Scalia felt a cold, reptilian fury spike in his gut, immediately followed by a chilling realization. This wasn't a glitch. The human was compatible. He didn't hesitate. Scalia slammed his hidden claw down onto the heavy red emergency stud on his console. Instantly, the stifling silence of the subterranean bunker was shattered. Klaxons began to howl, a mechanical, rhythmic shrieking that echoed down the concrete throat of Level 7 like wounded animals. Strobing red lights washed the corridors in the color of fresh blood. If he can survive the neural handshake, Scalia's mind raced, he is the key. He didn't want Arthur dead anymore. He wanted him captured, strapped to a vivisection table and studied down to his very marrow. He wanted to use the primate as a biological carrier pigeon to bypass the lunar artifact's lethal defense grid. "Breach and secure! Lethal force authorized only as a last resort," Scalia roared into the comms channel. 3 levels up, the elite response team moved. They were 12 men, ghosts in black tactical gear, armed with suppressed submachine guns and stun battens, moving with the terrifying synchronized fluidity of a diamond formation. They cascaded down the emergency stairwells, boots hammering the steel grating, converging on the hangar. Scalia wasn't going to sit in his chair and watch. He reached beneath his console and drew his personal sidearm, a heavy, brutal piece of alien engineering that fired condensed plasma rounds. He shoved his way out of the bunker, his human skin suit chafing agonizingly as he broke into a heavy, predatory sprint toward the elevator. He had to see this for himself. Inside the quiet, glowing sanctum of the sport model, Arthur was entirely unaware of the alarms. He had sunk into one of the four moulded seats. The petrified ash material seemed to soften, contouring perfectly to his spine. The heavy botanical scent of the prepared oil in his hair grounded him, acting as an anchor while his mind expanded. The terror that had gripped him since he had stepped onto the gantry bridge was gone, replaced by a profound, utterly relaxed clarity. The complex geometry on the long panel wasn't just math anymore. It was language. It was geography. As Arthur watched, the glowing lines peeled themselves off the two-dimensional surface, floating into the air and constructing a perfect, three-dimensional holographic projection of their destination. He saw the cold, grey expanse of the lunar surface. He saw the jagged edges of the Delport crater. And there, pulsing with an inviting indigo light, was the massive obsidian length of the Atlas-class artifact. It was beautiful. Arthur took a deep, shuddering breath. He opened his mouth, prepared to utter the words, "I'm ready," to the empty air, to the ship, to the universe itself. But before the sound could leave his throat, the physics inside the sanctum broke. The ambient light didn't just dim, it bent. It curved around Arthur's body, shimmering and dripping like water running down a pane of glass. A new sound arose beneath the hum of the infrared, a deep bass vibration that Arthur didn't hear with his ears, but felt in the iron of his blood. The ship wasn't starting an engine. It was untethering itself from reality. Outside, the 12-man diamond formation hit the second containment doors. They poured through the opening, weapons raised, tactical lights slicing through the dim gloom of the hangar. They hit the plastic curtain, tearing it down to expose the silvered teardrop resting on the floor. "Target sighted," the point man barked. "Move in." He didn't get to finish the sentence. The viscous illuminate hull flared with a brilliance that rivaled the surface of the sun. It wasn't an explosion. It was an instantaneous, absolute displacement of energy. Scalia had just cleared the vault doors when the flash hit. His ancient survival instincts screamed. He threw himself to the metal deck, throwing his arm up to shield his face. The light washed over the 12-man team. There was no scream. There was no blood. The energy simply evaporated them, turning their tactical gear, their weapons, and their flesh into a fine, grey mist that tasted violently of ozone. The shockwave rolled over Scalia, hot enough to instantly vaporize the left sleeve of his jacket. The synthetic human skin beneath it bubbled, melted and sloughed off in a sickening rush, exposing the thick, iridescent green and black scales of his true arm underneath. Scalia hissed in pain, rolling onto his back and pointing his plasma weapon at the center of the room. But there was nothing to shoot. Where the sport model had rested just a fraction of a second before, there was only empty air, a scorched circle on the metal floor, and the slowly settling dust of his elite response team. The craft had simply ceased to exist in local reality, linking out of the subterranean dark and slipping quietly into the void. Chapter 14. Deep within the belly of the Atlas artifact, silence wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a physical substance. It had poured in the pitch-black corridors for 1 billion years, heavy and suffocating, waiting. It was waiting for the mammalian cattle of Earth to finally wake up, waiting for the soft, frightened apes to evolve past their shiny cars and their crude, roaring rockets, to become psychologically robust enough to shoulder the terrible weight the ancient architects had intended for them. There had to be one, just one, who would one day emerge from the muck, strong enough to halt the grinding entropy introduced by the dark Scalia. Eons ago, the great AI, the cold, calculating superintelligence that wove the underlying physics of the cosmos, had grown the reptilian species for a purpose. Scalia and his kind were meant to be the ultimate progeny of the machine, biological guardians engineered to thrive in the toxic, crushing environments of virtually any planetary surface. But the AI, in its infinite logic, had miscalculated the corrosive, corrupting nature of free will. Scalia had a taste of the absolute power he was meant to protect, and like a rabid dog tasting blood for the first time, he decided he wanted the whole slaughterhouse. Destruction became his currency, cruelty became his religion. He looked at the AI's perfect balanced equations and violently called its right to rule into question. When Scalia discovered the grand design, that these fragile humans were destined to be the AI's ultimate power brokers, the biological wetware meant to inherit the stars, he had laughed until his cold blood burned. "Look at them," he sneered across the void. They were no match for him. The humans worshipped his glowing ships out of terrified ignorance, willingly handing over their own kind to his butchers in exchange for scraps of reverse-engineered technology. They were entirely his. His reptilian subcommanders had dwindled over the centuries, ground down by deep time and infighting, but there were still enough of them, deeply embedded in the Pentagon and the shadow governments of the world, to maintain a suffocating, iron-fisted status quo. But Scalia's continued existence wasn't just a matter of brute force or stolen black budget trillions. It was a matter of cosmic contract law. He had maintained his stranglehold on Earth because of a boast, a binding legal clause etched into the quantum framework of the AI system itself. It was the ultimate arrogant wager. "No man could outmatch me or the labyrinth of my systems," Scalia had declared to the machine god. "Until a single human proves otherwise, I am supreme. I will rule this rock forever." That was the ultimatum. The AI, governing the foundational mechanics of time, gravity and reality, possessed the power to instantly snuff out the life of every reptilian entity in the sector. It could have collapsed their sun or turned their blood to glass in a microsecond. Instead, it accepted the wager. It chose the agonizing path of infinite patience. It powered down its grandest vessel. It buried the Atlas-class artifact in the dead, freezing pumice of the Delport crater, plunging it into a billion-year sleep. And it waited. It waited for the cosmic roulette wheel to finally spin the right combination, waiting for the one human whose mind was perfectly tuned, who could synchronize with the geometry of creation, and who could finally call the bluff of that deeply corrupted, arrogant old lizard. In the sudden, shimmering glow of the sport model phasing into existence above the lunar surface, the ancient intelligence felt the presence of Arthur Steneston, and the billion-year silence finally broke. Chapter 15. The violent tearing of space-time didn't register as a sound or a physical jolt. It registered as an absence. A sudden, profound silence dropped over Arthur's mind like a heavy lead blanket, smothering the lingering adrenaline and the cold terror of the subterranean bunker. The swirling, three-dimensional holographic geography of the control panel simply dissolved, replaced by a soft, bioluminescent green-blue hue. The light pulsed gently, a rhythmic, breathing luminescence that trailed back down the transparent glass tube corridor he had just walked through. Arthur felt an overwhelming, narcotic calm. The peaceful feeling wasn't just in his head, it seemed to extend outward, saturating the very air inside the vessel. He unpeeled himself from the dark, petrified ash seat. It felt as though he had only just sat down. Yet the subtle shift in the ship's internal gravity suggested the impossible journey of 238,000 miles was already over. He turned and walked back toward the exit. The spun glass walls of the corridor no longer reflected the frantic, terrified ghosts of his own face. They reflected a man walking with the slow, purposeful gait of a sleepwalker. He reached the shimmering, phase-shifted threshold. The viscous aluminate parted like a silver waterfall, and Arthur stepped out of the sport model. He didn't step out into the freezing, irradiated vacuum of the Delport crater. The sport model had materialized perfectly within the deep maintenance bays of the Atlas artifact. But the word bay was a tragic, sterile human term for what lay before him. The first thing that hit him wasn't the bone-crushing chill of space, but the air. It was thick, sweet and hyper-oxygenated, hitting the back of his throat like the shot of pure adrenaline. It smelled of wet loam, crushed leaves, and the electric ozone of a summer thunderstorm. The atmosphere was perfectly calibrated to Earth's own, if not richer, sustained by an impossible ecosystem thriving in the belly of the ancient machine. Arthur walked forward, his rubber-soled shoes leaving the metal ramp of the sport model and sinking into the thick, spongy carpet of the luminous green moss. It was a primordial cathedral, enormous botanical structures, towering flora that looked like a majestic, terrifying cross between Californian redwoods and ancient fractal ferns, spiraled hundreds of feet into the air. Their massive, dark wood trunks were wider than passenger jets, reaching upward toward a staggering vaulted ceiling. And the ceiling wasn't dark. It was a simulated, brilliant cerulean sky. Golden, warm sunshine was flowing through the massive fronds, cascading from a gigantic, multifaceted crystal dome that comprised the entire forward section of the ancient vessel. The light caught the dust motes in the air, turning them into floating sparks of gold. Arthur stood in the middle of a billion-year-old indoor jungle on the dark side of the moon, a tiny figure dripping with sticky botanical oil and wearing a cheap polyblend shirt and a lab coat. A NASA engineer would have been paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of it. A military general would have screamed for a reconnaissance drone. The boffins back at Sector 4 would have spent billions engineering a pressurized suit just to look at the door. But as Arthur stepped fully into the vast, sunlit unknown of the alien terrarium, it did not even occur to him to be concerned about spacesuits or helmets. The ship had told him he was the passenger. It had told him he was home. And as the warm, simulated sun hit his face, Arthur believed it. End of Part 1.